So in verse 7, Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus, or Titius Justus, a worshipper of God. This is very interesting because if he was a worshipper of God, he probably was still an Orthodox Jew. But Crispus, the synagogue ruler, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard and believed were baptized. So he's actually dealing here not so much just with the Jews, but with the Gentiles, because he said he was going to go to the Gentiles. In verse 7, many of these were Gentiles. And in verse 9, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and said, "Don't be afraid, keep on speaking, don't be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." And you know, I was extremely conscious of that in my own ministry when I was working for 30 years in those communist countries, and 30 years afterwards, 60 years in all, working in the former Soviet Union. I was very conscious that although I had 4 attempts to assassinate me during those years, yet God always protected me. But in this case, it's very, very interesting to note that it says very clearly in the scripture in verse 10, "I'm with you and no one is going to attack you because I have many people in this city." So in actual fact, Paul stays here, it says, another 1.5 years teaching now Gentiles. Doesn't say he's preaching in the synagogue, because in the previous passage in verse 6, it says, Paul says, "I've cleared my responsibility with the Jews, and I'm going to go to the Gentiles." But he still stays another 18 months in Corinth, not in the synagogue, but he's now preaching to the Corinthians. And the scripture is clear. There were many believers. God said so. So it's quite interesting in verse 12. While Gallio was a proconsul of Achaia, which is the district, the whole of this district where they were in what is now Greece, this covers Athens and Corinth, the Jews now made a united attack on Paul and brought him into court. And in verse 13 it says, "This man," they charged, "is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law." Now, I find it's extremely interesting what happens, because the Jews, and remember, technically he's left them, but the Jews are attacking him and made an accusation in the court. But in verse 14, just as Paul was about to speak and defend himself, the proconsul said to the Jews, and I love this bit, it's so interesting. He says, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanour, some similar crime, I would listen to you. But because you are simply debating questions involving your own religion, since it involves, verse 15, questions about words and names and your own laws, you settle this among yourselves. I will not be judging such things. And he threw them out the court. So then in verse 17, these Jews turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler, and beat him in front of the court. But the proconsul, Gallio, didn't interfere. He just let them get on with it. But in verse 18, it's quite interesting because Paul still stayed in Corinth. And then so he didn't run away. He still stayed there for a while in ministry. But then it says in verse 18, he left the brothers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila, the tent makers, the Jewish tent makers. But for some reason, I don't understand, I can't find out why this happened. It says before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea. Now, Cenchrea, it's very close actually on the map. It's very close to where they were in Corinth. And it's possible that Cenchrea is the port from which they sailed. It may have been Corinth, it may have been Cenchrea, but they're very, very close together. So for some reason, he has his hair cut off. And then he sailed to Ephesus back. You know that Ephesus is one of the 7 churches of Revelation, which Paul had founded. So when he gets to Ephesus, he left Priscilla and Aquila. He went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. But when they asked him to spend more time, he refused. But he simply said in verse 21, I will come back if it's God's will. So he's leaving Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, and he now, in this verse 21, set sail from Ephesus back to Caesarea. That's a long sea journey. And when he gets to Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church in Caesarea, went to Jerusalem, because I think the church is referred to as actually in Jerusalem, and then he went down to Antioch, which is of course back in Syria, and again that's quite some distance. So after spending time in Antioch, he set out from there and travelled. The scripture simply says in verse 23, he travelled from place to place throughout Galatia and Phrygia. Now, Galatia covers the whole, really, of what is central Turkey, and I'm quite amazed that he covered such a vast area. We don't know how long he spent, but certainly it covers, in fact, Phrygia goes almost back as far as Ephesus. So this area in Phrygia, it's very interesting because this is where the 7 churches of Revelation are found. All of them, I've visited them. Oh yeah, I found them, I located them, visited them all. They're all 7 churches are in Phrygia. So that's interesting. And he was not founding churches, because it simply says he strengthened the disciples. So the churches were there, he strengthened them.